This is the story about our American Revolution. British General Lord Cornwallis could not suppress the American rebellion in the South. Frustrated by losses at Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis moved his army north to Virginia in an effort to turn off the spigot of French aid that was helping fuel the American resistance. By establishing a military base of operations at Yorktown, Cornwallis could be reinforced by British Royal Navy supply ships, vessels that were soon engaged in a fierce naval battle off the Virginia Capes. While French and British ships battled for control of the Chesapeake Bay, Generals George Washington and Rochambeau were marching their troops and wagon trains south through Virginia to lay siege to Yorktown, entrapping Cornwallis and his entire army. This is the story of that march.
Today, we're at Mount Vernon, home of George Washington. And we're delighted to have with us today also Dr. Robert A. Seelig, America's foremost expert on the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Trail. Bob, delighted to have you with us. And for my first question to you is, what is the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association, and what is the trail?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Randy, for this kind introduction. It's great to be here with you as we are talking about both the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association as well as about the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route. The W3R Association was created once Congress had designated this route that Allied forces take to Williamsburg a National Historic Trail, and the association has as its task to help make this trail known and to promote this trail and to promote Franco-American friendship and cooperation that dates back to the American Revolutionary War. Now, what is this Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route? Well, it's many things. To begin with, it is the story of the road and border and land roads taken by Allied forces from Newport, Rhode Island, and Newburgh, New York, all the way down to Yorktown in Virginia. It's not about the siege and the victory at Yorktown itself. What it also is, the story of the interaction between Americans and French as they are marching from New England and from New York all the way to Yorktown. Many Americans meet Frenchmen for the first time in their whole lives, and the W3R is the story of their interaction. What do they think about each other? How do they interact with each other? It is also, of course, then the story of the contributions of so many Americans to this victory in 1781. We tend to think that the War of Independence happens in Boston and Valley Forge and the Siege of Yorktown, but that victory would not have been possible if there hadn't been tens of thousands of Americans along the way that provided food, shelter, firewood, straw, and many other things that an army needs to march to Yorktown. And lastly, of course, as they are marching to Yorktown, they are marching many roads, they are traveling many waterways, they camp on very many sites, they're marching past many houses along the way, and the W3R is the story of these many sites and these many people that they encounter along their way to Yorktown in September of 1781. What better place to start our story and of the trail that goes from Northern Virginia here all the way down to Yorktown than at Mount Vernon the home of George Washington. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the name of George Washington before. There's hardly a city, a town in the United States that doesn't have a George Washington Street or Avenue, or a George Washington School, or a George Washington Bridge. And I'm sure you've also heard about Mount Vernon, this magnificent home of General Washington. But if you've been here or if you've seen pictures, don't be fooled. George Washington didn't live here for much of his life. As a matter of fact, he wasn't even born here. He was born about 50 or 60 miles from here, south of here, in a different place. And George Washington wasn't always rich, didn't always have a house like this to live on. His father died when George Washington was only 11 years old. And while Washington wasn't poor, he certainly didn't belong to the richest families here in colonial Virginia. His brother, his half-brother Lawrence, helped to introduce him into the wealthiest families, the Fairfaxes and others, and made connections for him. And it is with the help of his brother Lawrence, his half-brother Lawrence, that George Washington in 1754 becomes a colonel in the Virginia militia and fights in the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, as it's called in other parts of the world. But in 1758, then, when he's 28 years old, Washington retires from the military and marries a Martha Dandridge, a 26-year-old widow who is much wealthier than he is. And so you would think by 1761, when he moves into Mount Vernon, he inherits Mount Vernon, that he's ready to settle down into life of a wealthy plantation owner and start a family and live happily ever after, as they say. But we all know that's not what happened, of course, because shortly thereafter, trouble with the British Parliament starts. That war had been very expensive, and Parliament in London wanted the colonists over here to help pay for that war. But as I'm sure you've all heard this term, no taxation without representation, and Washington was also one of those who at some point wrote that he didn't think that Parliament had the right to put its hand into his own pockets and takes money out of his pockets without Washington's approval. And so Washington very early on is in part of this opposition to the laws that Parliament is passing. And we all know that in 1775, then at Lexington and Concord, there's that shot that is heard around the world, and the War of Independence has started. And then in June of 1775, Washington is appointed a general and the commanding officer of the Continental Army, and he will stay the commanding officer of the Continental Army until the war is over. But that, of course, also means that once the war has started and he is up in Boston, he will not see Mount Vernon for the next 6 years or so until Washington and the Continental Army, and by then the French Army, are marching past here on the way to Yorktown. So that's a long time to be away from home. So we might ask, what brought the French here in 1781, marching down the East Coast from their headquarters in Newport, Rhode Island, together with the Continental Army from New York. And I think we are very fortunate to have with us today the commanding officer of these French forces, the Comte de Rochambeau. Welcome to Mount Vernon. It's a great pleasure to see you.
Good day, sir. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Well, as you know, France had been assisting what was then the colonies fighting against the British from a very early stage. And His Majesty King Louis XVI decided that now was the moment to which France should respond officially and send ground forces and the French Navy, or elements thereof, to assist the Americans in their bid for independence. We are here in Virginia today because General Washington and I met on several occasions in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and then in New York once the French forces left Newport and marched through Connecticut to get to our objective, at that time considered to be New York. That was General Washington's plan. That's what he wanted to do from the very, very start. I was somewhat reticent to accept that sort of plan because New York was a very heavily fortified city. It was very well encamped with the British. There was also a very loyal population in New York that would have made such a campaign very difficult indeed. I felt that we should probably look at moving south. We knew that General Lord Cornwallis was moving through the area, being tailed by General Lafayette, but we also knew that the French Navy would be in the area soon and might perhaps be able to lend assistance in defeating the British fleet in the Chesapeake Bay. It's at that point that we convened and determined in New York before marching south that we would instead focus on General Lord Cornwallis in the peninsula's area of Virginia. In 1781, we decided we would move from New York through Pennsylvania, through New Jersey, through Maryland, ending up here in Virginia on our way south the 200 remaining miles to get to Yorktown, where General Lord Cornwallis had put himself to build fortifications, which we knew we could not accept as that would potentially cut off the southern states from the northern states and lose the war.
Now, General, you said you met General Washington for the first time in Hartford in 1780 and then in Newport and Wethersfield. What did you know about General Washington before you came to the United States?
Yes, that's a very good question indeed. Well, of course, we knew of General Washington when he was not a general at the time, as the general had played an integral part in setting in motion the chain of events that created for us called the 7 Years' War in Europe, here the French and Indian War. So we knew of George Washington most certainly. It was surprising to me to see how far he had come in that time period of only 25 years or so to become now the commanding general of the American forces fighting the British. We knew him to be a methodical, a very calculating and plain-speaking individual. We knew him to be determined in what he was going to do, and we knew him to be dedicated to the American cause. So we had no qualms whatsoever in his being trusted with command of the American Army.
Now, your instructions from the Convention said that General Washington is supposed to be your superior, and you're supposed to follow his orders, but you are a soldier with 30 years or more of experience. How difficult is that for you to take orders from somebody who had been a colonel in the British Army and with practically no military experience compared to what you know?
Well, you have to understand that this is a different continent. It's a different environment. The landscape is different, the people are different, and the causes are different here than what I experienced in Europe. I came here to serve, not to command. And I had absolutely no problems whatsoever in taking orders from General Washington, but I have yet to receive any. I have to tell you that the relationship between General Washington and myself is most cordial. We are quite amiable. While we must communicate through various means, I have found him to be a very patient, understanding, and a very conscientious leader. He has taken my counsel and my advice willingly, often, and has incorporated that into his own stratagem. And I find the general to be an extremely capable commander.
Well, that's good to know. So you're getting along with him very well.
Most assuredly, sir, most assuredly.
Now that we're here at Mount Vernon, it's a beautiful place, as I think you agree.
Indeed.
How does that compare to your chateau in Torre-la-Rochette?
Well, as you know, the Chateau de Rochambeau is a beautiful site, no doubt about it. The gardens are very lovely, but here we look out on this magnificent vista. We have the Potomac River behind us. We have this lovely emplacement here of house, of outbuildings, of fields, of water, of lawn. It is most inviting and most comfortable, in my opinion. It is different. It is a different country here, sir, and the traditions are not the same as in France.
Oh, I think I see General Washington waving toward you. I think it's time
yes,
to move on.
Indeed.
I certainly hope that we will meet again somewhere along the route as we are following you and your army and the Continental Army all the way down to Yorktown and hopefully victory, of course.
As do I, as your servant, sir.
Bob, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today, and particularly for getting that wonderful discussion with Comte de Rochambeau. To our viewers, thank you for watching. Join us next time we visit Old Colchester Road along the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route. On behalf of the Real American Revolution, this is Randy Flood. So long for now.